did you treat individuals in Downing Street with offence and misogyny, Mr. Cummings?
Certainly not.
Could we have 283369, please, an extract from Mr. Johnson's Fight Back WhatsApp group? Page 37. Just to pick up the thread of the chronology, if you could scroll in on the top of the page. We could see that the first WhatsApp is 21st of August 2020. Mr. Johnson says the mail has fucked up remnants of my Scottish break, so back in checkers and in a thoroughly homicidal mood. We need a plan for the Department of Education, PermSec, better ministers, reform. There is then some communication between him and Mr. Kane and you at the bottom of the page. And then over the page, please, to page 38. You say this at 12:20. If I have to come back to Helen's bullshit with PET, was that propriety and ethics?
Yes.
Part of the Cabinet Office, or number 10. Designed to waste huge amounts of my time so I can't spend it on other stuff, I'll personally handcuff her and escort her from the building. Had you got form, Mr. Cummings, for arranging for people to be escorted from number 10 before?
You shouldn't believe everything you read in the newspapers. That story is not accurate.
I don't care how it's done, but that woman must be out of our hair. We cannot keep dealing with this horrific meltdown of the British state while dodging stilettos from that cunt. Page 10 of 283282. We got to get Helen out of cab off. She's fucking up Frosty. She's fucking up me and Case. She's trying to get Spads fired and cause trouble on multiple fronts. Can we get her in Monday for chat re her moving to community local government or DFT Department for Trade? We need her out ASAP, building millions of lovely houses. If you go back one page to page 7, please, 3 pages in the same document, we will see a way in which you speak of a professional scientist who gave his time and considerable amounts of energy to SAGE, Professor Neil Ferguson. A third of the way down, we should get someone to hammer Ferguson. Mr. Cummings, was that aggressive and foul-mouthed and misogynistic approach the correct way to manage fellow professionals?
I don't know what the Ferguson thing is referring to, but in terms of Helen and the situation in the Cabinet Office, you need to understand that the Prime Minister had, first of all, tried to sack the Cabinet Secretary and then botched it, and he was still there. Then he'd said to everyone that he wanted Helen to be removed as well, and that he'd lost confidence in Helen. The new Cabinet Secretary had said that he wanted to have the authority to change both the PPS and choose his deputy, i.e. Helen. The Prime Minister had then trolleyed back on this as well. So we were in this absolutely nightmare situation where the PM had made clear that he didn't have confidence in either of the two senior officials, had said to people he was going to remove them, then he didn't remove them for week after week. This led to an absolutely nightmare situation. Now, my language about Helen is, the language is obviously appalling, and actually I got on well with Helen at a personal level, but 1,000 times worse than my bad language is the underlying issue at stake, that we had a Cabinet Office system that had completely melted, and the Prime Minister had half begun the process of changing the senior management and then stopped. So me and other people were desperately trying to build a new system with a new cabinet secretary over this period in order to get ready for September. And then suddenly we were getting dragged out of meetings on things like test and trace and vaccines to be told that we had to deal with Cabinet Office HR issues and legal questions regarding judicial reviews and jolly on morn. This is, Kafkaesque nightmare doesn't even begin to explain it. So I apologise for my language towards Helen, but 1,000 times worse than my language was the underlying insanity of the situation in Number 10.
You run a blog, do you not?
Yes.
On the 5th of July 2021, 273905, so about 5 or 6 months later, you said, I and my team worked with Boris in the referendum. Some of us worked with him, officially or unofficially, between the referendum and summer 2019. We knew his skills and his weaknesses. We knew he was, in any objective sense, unfit to be Prime Minister. We also knew that he knew too, since he'd told us. Is that your blog?
It is.
Elsewhere in your blog, do you say things like, self-aware Boris knows that normal Boris cannot manage, cannot focus. He won't read papers. He cannot chair meetings to save his life.
Yes. Is that a question?
Did you say that in your blog?
Sounds familiar.
In your statement, did you say that he couldn't chair meetings, stick to a plan, or build a high-performance team?
For sure.
Whether right or wrong, Mr. Cummings, and the inquiry will, of course, hear from Mr. Johnson, will make its own mind up, you helped to put him there, did you not?
Sure.
You denigrated Helen McNamara, and you sent that misogynistic message about her. Did you not?
No, that's not correct. I was not misogynistic. I was much ruder about men than I was about Helen. I agree that my language is deplorable, but as you can see for yourself, I deployed the same or worse language about the Prime Minister, Secretary of State and other people. If you want to look at how we actually ran things, unlike Whitehall, I had 2 young women as my deputies. I hired young women into the data science team in the Vote Leave campaign. I actually put a young woman in her 30s in charge of it, much to the rage of a lot of MPs. So if you look at the reality of how I actually ran teams and how I got on with the private secretaries in Number 10, you will see the truth of the matter. Obviously, there was a general feeling in Number 10 that the way in which the Prime Minister responded constantly to the media was extremely bad and extremely damaging to the COVID response. There were specific concerns about his relationship with the Barclays and the Telegraph, and there were specific concerns and also suspicions of possible corruption in terms of his relationship with Osborne and funneling money to the Evening Standard.
Just pause there. I am going to ask you another question then about the press. Is it the Evening Standard that is owned by Lord Lebedev?
Yes.
And is it Lord Lebedev he met, spoke to on the phone and met, in fact, in the evening of Thursday, the 12th or 19th of March?
I think I remember seeing a reference to the 19th.
The 19th. All right. In your statement, you describe how, following this email, the Prime Minister, whilst initially agreeing with the sentiment of your trenchant views on aspects of the government machine, listened to use your word, pop-ins, and then got cold feet. What are pop-ins?
So obviously the context for this document is it comes after 8 weeks of a nightmare situation kicked off by the PM.
I do apologise, Mr. Cummings. What are pop-ins?
Pop-ins are what people in private office refer to when the Prime Minister would make a decision about something. Some element of the system, often in the Cabinet Office, would not like what had been agreed, And in the best Sir Humphrey Westminster style, they would wait for me and other people to not be around the Prime Minister, and they would pop in to see the Prime Minister and say, "Dear Prime Minister, I think that this decision really wasn't the best idea. Very brave Prime Minister. Perhaps you should trolley on it." And this was a general problem.
You should trolley on it. Meaning?
Well, I'm sort of using the sort of generic term that we often used about the PM.
The term you used and his cabinet secretary used and his director of communications used and other officials, no doubt, about his propensity to...
Pretty much everyone called him the trolley, yeah.
Due in large part to your own WhatsApps, Mr. Cummings, we're going to have to coarsen our language somewhat.
I apologise.
You called ministers useless fuckpigs, morons, cunts, in emails and WhatsApps to your professional colleagues. Do you think you contributed to a lack of effectiveness on the part of ministers and of the cabinet?
No, I think I was reflecting a widespread view amongst competent people at the centre of power at the time about the calibre of a lot of senior people who were dealing with this crisis extremely badly.
Slow down, please, Mr. Cummings. Are you suggesting that your views expressed in those revolting ways were shared by others?
Well, my appalling language is obviously my own, but my judgment of a lot of senior people was widespread. I'm not claiming that this is universal. I'm saying that it was a general feature and it was much more often true than not.
You refer in your statement to Cabinet and Cabinet Committee meetings being Potemkin meetings. What did you mean by that?
They were Potemkin in the sense that they were for show, as part of the sort of show of the Constitution. That, you know, unfortunately, a large part of how the system works is that ministers parade up Downing Street, the cameras click, people act like Cabinet is actually deciding things. But everyone behind the number 10 door actually near power knows that that's very rarely actually what's going on. That usually what's happening is that senior officials have actually decided what's happening. And the ministerial performance is often / usually a performance. Of course, that changes according to historical situations and crises. And sometimes Cabinet, even in 2019, 2020, became genuinely important, but I'm just trying to give a general picture.
On the cusp of the coronavirus pandemic, where was power exercised? Where was the effective decision-making?
By cusp, where do you mean, sorry?
January, February.
Well, it certainly wasn't in Cabinet.
Where was it?
Well, most power really is nominally in the hands of the Prime Minister and to a very large extent in the hands of the Cabinet Office. I would say the Cabinet Secretary is something like 10 times or 100 times more powerful than anybody else in the Cabinet apart from the Prime Minister.
Your views on the Secretary of State for the Department of Health and Social Care are very well known, and we'll be looking at some of your remarks about him in due course. Overall, the tenor of your statement, it's the effect, and this is to use your words, that senior ministers, senior officials, and senior advisors like yourself fell disastrously short of the standards that the public had to expect. Is that a view you adhere to still?
It is. I also think there were many exceptional people, as I've tried to also explain in my statement, but they were all enmeshed in a fundamentally dysfunctional structure, and that meant that even the great people were often unable to do great work.
You also say that it is completely crackers that someone like you should have been in number 10. Is that a view you still maintain?
For sure.
Ultimately, who bears the responsibility, Mr. Cummings, for appointing the individuals whom you have described in these terms?
Well, lots of them obviously were appointed. Lots of the critical Cabinet Office roles were appointed before me and the Prime Minister arrived. The Prime Minister obviously bears responsibility for the Cabinet. He appointed the Cabinet in summer 2019. Contrary to all the media reports, I had zero involvement with that. I tried to get him to change it in January and failed, tried to get him to change it in February and almost completely failed.
Do you think your description of your colleagues, the way in which you described them, their functions, their abilities, their talents, added to that dysfunctionality?
No, I think the opposite. I think my job, a huge part of the problem of the culture of Westminster and Whitehall that was so disastrous in COVID is people not speaking out about core problems. And I regarded my job as, I'm not a very smart person, I'm not a specialist in all sorts of ways, but I had built very effective teams. And I felt that a crucial part of my job was to say to the PM and to other people, if I thought that someone couldn't do the job, then to make that clear, because A, that's so fundamental to performance, and B, the issue is so often buried in Whitehall.
Was it around that time that you sent multiple emails and WhatsApps and messages to Mr. Johnson and others stating that your belief was that you were being misled by Mr. Hancock, misled by the DHSE in relation to assertions as to what was being done to protect the care home sector, what was being done to ramp up testing, and what was being done to get inadequate supplies of PPE?
Yes, multiple officials, including Mr. Shinner and an excellent private secretary, Alexandra Burns, raised issues with me that they thought that what was being said in the morning meetings about those issues was not accurate. And I tried to convey this to the PM, as to be fair to him, also, as Mark said, well, the Cabinet Secretary did.
Could we have 48313, page 16? This is an extract from your letter to the inquiry dated the 7th of May. You say that Mr. Hancock is unfit for this job, the incompetence, the constant lies, the obsession with media bullshit over doing his job. Still no fucking serious testing in care homes. His uselessness is still killing God knows how many. This morning are you addressing this to Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Must ask him when we will get to 500,000. Is that tests per
Correct.
day? And where is your plan for testing all care home workers weekly?
Yes.
If you could go, please, scroll out and go to the bottom of that page, and then scroll in on the last entry. You need to think through timing of binning Hancock. There's no way the guy can stay. He's lied his way through this and killed people, and dozens of people have seen it. Was it around this time, in fact on the 15th of May, that Mr. Hancock said, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes?
I believe so. You have the date. I'm sure you're right.
And was it around this time, therefore, that in number 10 there was repeated consideration to the issue of sacking Mr. Hancock?
Yes, and I also had complaints from officials to me, entirely rightly. The Cabinet Secretary said to me himself, the British system does not work if ministers lie at the Cabinet table, and you have to convey this to the PM. I think the Cabinet Secretary was completely right. There was only so much that he could do. This was fundamentally a political matter, and I did what I could.
This is an email between yourself, I think Helen McNamara and others, dated the 13th of March. Your email is in the middle of the page. The PM view and mine on those Cobras is that they are hopeless as decision-making entities and actively cause trouble for comms, given they just brief immediately. So there you're focusing not on the practical difficulties of data or the national security restrictions over the use of the room, but because you thought they were hopeless as decision-making entities and they caused trouble for comms.
Yes.
On the 15th of March, in a WhatsApp thread, number 10 action, 236371, page 52, this is a WhatsApp sent after Mark Sedwell, now Lord Sedwell, the Cabinet Secretary, had produced a note to the Prime Minister concerning the committee structure moving forward, the institution of something called ministerial implementation groups and the 9:15 meetings. PM, it would be good if you could sign off the note from Mark Sedwell on moving to the next phase, structures, etc., ideally before the meeting this PM, so we could get things moving on that. Dominic Cummings, can you send on WhatsApp my work computer battery flat? I can't recharge for an hour. The draft I saw looked okay, as it was basically drafted by us. Who is us?
I'm not sure exactly, but some combination, I think, of me, Imran, Ben Warner.
Except it's still too keen on Cobras with DAs. The PM daily meetings must be in the cabinet room with spider phones and screens, not in Cobra where nobody can take laptops and phones. So there is a clear reference to the practical considerations, but also you were not keen on the devolved administrations being concerned in and attending Cobra.
No, that's not. They're different issues. If you're having meetings to actually figure out the truth, then meetings like that have to be conducted in a very different way. They can't be one of these things with 50 people on a video conference with the DAs when things immediately... Those DA meetings were not meetings to try to figure out the truth about hard issues. They were meetings as part of the kind of performance and coordination and the constitutional function. And my concern was that even at this late stage in the crisis, a lot of people in the Cabinet Office were still fixated on the kind of Potemkin, maintaining the Potemkin aspects rather than actually getting to the heart of things. And we couldn't get to the heart of things in that room because you literally couldn't take in the information and show it to the PM and have a proper discussion about it.
Why did you want Michael Gove to be in charge of regular devolved administration updates and not the Prime Minister?
I thought Gove would handle it 10 times better.
Handle what 10 times better?
Handle the process of dealing with the DAs. You know, and also bear in mind that as I said before, the whole XSXO structure, Michael Gove had more experience of anybody.
Slow down, please, Mr. Cummings.
Michael Gove had more experience of anybody in that room, the Cobra briefing room, because he was in there literally daily from July, August, September, etc., all the way through 2019. So I knew that he understood the whole rhythm, the process, the structure, the staff, and it just seemed like an obvious sort of way of divvying up responsibilities.
Mr. Gove was the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, was he not?
Yeah.
Was he the Prime Minister?
Was he what, sorry?
Was he the Prime Minister?
Obviously not.
No. Did you not want the Prime Minister to be in a meeting room with the devolved administrations, the constituent parts of the United Kingdom? I thought it
preferable to have the Prime Minister actually focused on the impending catastrophe that we faced on that day. And I thought that, generally speaking, him talking to the DAs did not advance any cause.
In relation to the reporting system through the Chief Medical Officer and the government's Chief Scientific Advisor, were those briefings by them to government recorded or were they oral?
What do you mean by recorded? Do you mean minuted?
Well, were they minuted? Did they produce papers in support of everything they said? Or was this funnel of communication largely an oral one?
It was largely an oral one, though, of course, the Private Secretary would record notes from the meeting and then issue action points and other things in the normal way from the private office.
The SAGE minutes were, as you've described them, consensus documents, and others have described them similarly. Did number 10 get a proper understanding of the width of debate that had taken place before SAGE and of the nuance of these extremely difficult and complex issues?
In my opinion, obviously not. I mean, there's no substitute for actually listening to these conversations oneself and interrogating people. I'm not saying by that the SAGE minutes themselves were a bad product. I think they were a good product and a useful product. But if you're asking about the nature of a crisis like this involving the Prime Minister having to make extraordinary decisions, he obviously needed much richer information than the SAGE minutes could provide.
SAGE and NervTag specifically advised the government against border screening because they took the view that it would be ineffective. You can't test in the absence of a testing system for asymptomatic patients. You can conceal your symptoms. You may even become infected on a plane and no symptoms will show until after you've arrived. So did the government not appreciate that in practical terms, such a step would be extremely difficult to put into practice?
Well, yes, we would I'm not sure if I've misunderstood, but one of us has misunderstood. We were told that it was impossible. We were told the British state couldn't do it in January. We didn't have the infrastructure to do it. They didn't have the tests to do it. Didn't have any of the things that you need to do it to control the border. But at the same time, it wasn't regarded as a big problem, given that people didn't want to control the border anyway.
Is that fair, Mr. Cummings? Sage and NervTag produced papers which were sent to the government and which you presumably saw, setting out why in practice screening, restrictions, or even an elemental quarantine system would not work in practice. It wasn't a doctrinal position, was it?
No, well, I think that obviously if you're just saying, do you actually control the borders? Does that solve the problem? Of course, the answer is no. And if you're looking at just at the specific issue of what the effect of controlling the borders would be, then of course the answer is clear. And what Sage and NervTag said makes sense. But that's obviously not the real question. The real question is, should you have the capabilities like Singapore or Taiwan to combine actual serious border control with a domestic test and trace regime and the data to support it and all the other things you need to support it and then roll out mass testing? If you had the capability to do that, which I very strongly suggest this country ought to acquire, then obviously controlling the borders is a critical issue.
The Prime Minister, the evidence shows, received a note in his box on the 30th of January, around about the same time, about coronavirus. He expressed the view on the 31st of January that he wanted to spend more time discussing issues with ministers, and then he received an update on the 3rd of February from the Civil Committee's Secretariat. There was then an email with an update on the 8th of February and the meeting on the 10th of February to which you have referred. We'll just have a look at the diary for that, 136739. This is the diary for the Prime Minister between the 10th of February and Friday the 14th of February. On the 10th of February, so you're right, it's a Monday, 10:45 to 11:15, coronavirus update. Before he went to Cheveney, which he did on the 14th of February, he received a note in his box, 136743, page 4. Coronavirus international response. Containment of the virus in China is a key part of preventing the spread of the outbreak to the United Kingdom. If what you were told by the chief scientist was right, the chief scientific advisor was right, Mr. Cummings, that there was an inevitability or a probable inevitability to the virus sweeping the world, then any debate about whether or not the virus could be contained in China was out of date. Why was the Prime Minister not told? Evidence is now emerging that this virus is out of control and will likely sweep the world, and debate about international repatriation and drafting of legislation and doctrinal identification of reasonable worst-case scenarios is behind us. We need to deal with that loss of control.
Well, I think there was still an awful lot of. So the meeting that Patrick and I asked for on the 10th, from memory, these things were discussed. But remember, at that point, it was still not at all seen in Whitehall like this is going to be. Nobody really in Whitehall thought that a month from now we're going to be in the biggest crisis the country's seen since 1945. The view was much more that if this is really going to happen, it's not going to happen for months. And you can see repeated references in documents to Number 10 and the Prime Minister that refer to, well, if there is sustained community transmission in Britain, then the crisis will come sort of 2 or 3 months after, which is repeated in various documents. I remember at this point, although there was, in fact, we now know, sustained transmission in this country at that time, that was not known then. So the whole system was, at this point, and not just now, but 3 weeks after this point, still thinking of this as something that was going to land on people in May, June, not something that was going to overwhelm everybody in mid-March.
Mr. Hancock, in a WhatsApp message with Damon Poole, dated the 23rd of May, says, herd immunity was never the government strategy, but it was what Dom was pushing until he was finally persuaded to drop it in early March. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it's obviously laughable.
When did it become apparent that modelling may not have been necessary in order to drive home the point that with the number of deaths and hospital cases that were the inevitable result of the infection fatality rate and the hospitalisation rate, the healthcare system would be likely to be overwhelmed?
So Mark and Ben Warner raised this with me from a kind of week before this point of the 10th, 11th of March. But when it really came home very starkly was after I asked, I think on the Monday, Imran, but somehow between us anyway, Imran and I asked the NHS to provide their data, which for some odd reason hadn't come through. And there's references to that between Warner and Valence as well. That data arrived, and I asked to get Simon Stevens in to present it, which I think happened on the 12th. All the records are a bit iffy on that day for reasons that you're aware of. But when we saw these NHS documents, and Mark Warner explained the background of it, that's what really made things incredibly stark, because you suddenly had these two completely divergent sets of graphs, one from the NHS and one from the COBRA system.
By the 11th of March, was it generally well understood in Downing Street that a large percentage, a large proportion of this disease for the viral spread, in fact, was transmitted asymptomatically?
It was, and Mr. Hancock had made this point in multiple ways, and sowed chaos by saying this. He was repeatedly told by Patrick Vallance that what he was saying was wrong, but he kept saying it. He said it here. And if you notice, it makes its way into statements that have been provided to this inquiry. So this false meme lodged itself in crucial people's minds. I don't understand, never understood why Hancock said this, but Patrick Vallance made extremely clear to me and to others in Number 10 that what Hancock was saying was factually wrong.
We can see Mr. Johnson said, you speak of briefings from Team Carrie. Is that a reference to the allegation that she had briefed against you, colleagues of hers had been briefing against you and may have been involved in leaks? She hasn't briefed anyone, and my instructions to all were to shut the fuck up. How is any of us supposed to know where these briefings come from? Look at the claims made on behalf of allies of Lee and Dom, that I'm out in 6 months, that I can't take decisions, that Carrie is secretly forging lockdown policy, and about 1 billion equally demented claims. Are you responsible for all that crap? No? Then look at it from my point of view. This is a totally disgusting orgy of narcissism by a government that should be solving a national crisis. We must end this. That's why I wanted to talk and see what we could jointly do to sterilise the whole thing. But if you really refuse, then that's up to you. You left the WhatsApp group as we can see, because you blocked the contact shortly thereafter. He has a good turn of phrase, Mr. Johnson. Would you agree that there was, in the government of which you played a major part, an orgy of narcissism?
Certainly there was.
Perhaps in deference to your support, he supported you when the Barnard Castle affair exploded in Easter 2020, did he not?
Yes.
For health and security reasons, you drove from London to Durham over the weekend of the 27th to the 29th of March at the height of the lockdown with your wife and child, correct?
It's the 27th of Friday, yes.
I don't know when you drove, but it was over the weekend, the 27th to the 29th.
It was the night of that Friday, the day that the PM got COVID.
In your statement, you say that the Prime Minister knew that you had moved your family out of London, but his WhatsApp messages, 226 225, page 22, are adamant that you never told him that you'd gone to Durham during the lockdown, and he only discovered when the stories started to come in. (226, 225, page 22). Whether or not you told him, on the 12th of April, you drove 25 miles to Barnard Castle to test your eyesight. Yes?
Did
you drive to Barnard Castle?
Are you asking about the whole thing or just about the 12th?
I want to ask you about Barnard Castle on the 12th of April.
Yes,
Did you drive there?
Yes.
Did you take your wife and your child in that car?
Yes.
Why did you need them in the car to be able to drive to test your eyesight?
Because, well, as I explained to MPs a couple of years ago...
No, just tell us, please.
I am. So in the days up until the 12th, of course, the PM was increasingly sick. I was getting messages from Lee Kane and others about the diabolical situation.
Why did you... Excuse me.
Sorry, you asked me to answer the question, so I'm answering the question.
Why did you take your wife and child in that car to enable you to test your eyesight?
As I was saying, I was asked to go down, to drive back down to London because of the terrible situation with the government. I had intended to go the day before on Saturday, but I was too ill to do so. On the 12th, I thought, right, I'll drive down the road, drive back, see how I feel, and if I feel okay, then I'll drive back the next day. Back to London, I mean.
Why did you have to have your wife and child in the car to assist you to drive down the road?
Well, obviously I didn't have to have them in the car.
That day, the 12th of April, was it your wife's birthday?
It was.
Was it Easter Sunday?
I think so.
You recognise, of course, that confidence in the United Kingdom government's handling of the epidemic collapsed after that matter came to light and after your press conference in the Rose Garden.
I think, so it was certainly a disaster, the whole handling of the situation, but there were other factors involved with it all as well. Testing and PPE and many other things were all going haywire at the time.
Do you accept that your behaviour, whether a breach of the rules or not, caused immeasurable offence and additional pain to the bereaved?
Well, I'd had to move my family out of the house. I'd had to call on police because of incidents at my house, which I discussed with the police and with the Prime Minister and with the Deputy Cabinet Secretary. So in terms of moving my family out of the house for security reasons, no, it was completely reasonable and agreed by everybody at the time to be reasonable.
However, the 12th of April and the drive to Barnard Castle, about which you spoke at great length in that press conference, do you acknowledge it caused immeasurable offence and additional pain to the bereaved who were unable to see their own loved one die?
Yes, I think the way that we handled it was an absolute car crash and a disaster, and did cause a lot of people pain.
I'm not concerned with the handling the aftermath of that event. I'm asking you, do you accept that that apparent breach of the rules caused enormous offence and pain to the people in this country whose loved ones were dying?
No, I think we're talking about two different things. I think the handling of it was a disaster and caused huge trouble and huge pain to a lot of people, and I very much regret and have already apologised for how badly Number 10 handled the whole thing. But in terms of my actual actions in going north and then coming back down, I acted entirely reasonably and legally and did not break any rules.